Are we done talking about it now? Me, you, arguing in the comments over and over about whether or not Garuda's passive is an exalted ability? We're done, okay? I'm over here in my little corner like, actually, it's not a f***ing exalted ability. Conversation's over, right? The devs said it themselves. But I'm still going to cover it in its own video because I think it deserves one, and it isn't getting included in the previous one because of that. Today, we're covering Garuda's Talons, which recently got the change to be able to use Arcane slots. It won't be a particularly long video because it's literally the only change it received, but it is a substantial one to a weapon that was already very much slept on across the game. Claw weapons in general aren't the greatest, usually due to their lack of range, but now we have the ability to cheese that range with something like Influence, but obviously we're not just going to talk about Influence today, especially considering that this thing was already good. Garuda's Talons are her passive, where if you unequip a melee weapon, you will automatically have these equipped. A set of claws with really good base stats. Solid attack speed, overall status, crit and damage, weighing heavily into slash, and interestingly enough, the Prime variant actually has better base stats. So getting your hands on Garuda Prime is a much better investment than you may think. Now before the update, Garuda's Talons were already very strong, especially with something like Viral and Heat. It was easy to overlook them due to Influence being meta, but I still use these things even regardless. And to be honest, the performance with Arcanes in mind is actually comparable to most Exalted weapons. There's not a single set of claws in the game that remotely competes with these, and I feel like if you're playing Garuda, you're kind of missing out if you're not equipping them. Let's quickly talk about Influence for a sec. Obviously, it's a great way to go about things. One of my Garuda builds actually already uses Nourish, so I don't have to fit in any viral setup, usually just opting to build it for electricity and a bunch of crit and status mods. Either that, or I can equip something like a Panzervolk Profiler or any companion to proc viral. Even then, viral isn't overly necessary. I don't think there's any weapon in the game that feels as much like a blender than these things do, so simply spreading your damage with electricity and influence is obviously a great way to go, but what if we switched it up and maybe modded for a different arcane to not just keep using the same build over and over? Although Garuda's Talons can lift enemies up due to the stances available, the results were kind of mixed for me when using Afflictions. Afflictions of course adding stacks to status procs whenever you lift enemies up or knock them down with that melee weapon. When I was trying this, it wasn't very good. I don't know why, it just feels like it wasn't proccing too much, or at least not doing enough damage, which is just beyond strange to me. What was working exceptionally well though was Melee Vortex. We're not exactly spoiled for options when it comes to modding for melee arcanes, and that's primarily due to Influence just outclassing all of the other ones. Although that may be true here, Melee Vortex is actually a really good companion with Garuda. At base, she lacks grouping, but her kit actually does synergize really well with something like Nautilus, for example. Being able to spread slash and then send out huge amounts of damage with her orb. Building for range is amazing on her, but you may also want the luxury of having grouping, so that way you can drop a bit of range off your build. Throwing on Magnetic to your Talons will allow you to proc Melee Vortex. Killing an enemy affected by Magnetic will of course pull enemies in, much like Nautilus, also meaning you can switch up your companion. Already this combination makes you tear down enemies at a much faster rate than most of the other melee arcanes, Influence of course doing the opposite and spreading the damage in a wide radius. And on the topic of being able to build her for less range when using Melee Vortex, we could talk about the combination of her augment Dread Ward and how it requires a lot of duration, maybe something like Narrow Minded, which reduces your range. Range feels exceptional on this Warframe, but with Dread Ward equipped, you're not going to be relying on shield getting to stay alive, rather the augment itself, for long durations of health invulnerability. Unfortunately, this is like Excalibur's old slash dash where you would take damage through shields but not your HP. Dread Ward is an augment that activates this health invulnerability whenever you kill an enemy with your 1, and Dread Ward will kill enemies on lower HP instantly, activating this augment making it a very valuable way of surviving, but you want to pump it full of duration of course. Now Reminded being a great option with prime continuity, at the cost of some of your power range, making overall your 4 and your 1 not as useful, so you still want to compensate with that range, being that you can now pull enemies in with a much more effective version of your Talons. For me, it makes using a build like this much more comfortable. So as for how I'm modding my Melee Vortex build, we are not using a Nautilus because we have Vortex in the equation, and then our Garuda setup has a different subzoom which we'll get onto in a second. Of course we have Magnetic Rush in here to be able to proc Vortex, and then the rest is pretty much optional. This thing is easily moddable for both crit and status. I love seeing the huge slash damage that comes with Buzzkill, and Weeping Wounds also helps to proc this. Of course, once you proc Vortex, it's going to pull enemies in, not only making them susceptible to the Talons themselves, but also making it so that any enemies you want to kill with your orb or your Garuda abilities in general are going to be close enough so that you don't need as much power range to get that damage off. And due to melee Vortex, we don't need a Nautilus, so we're using a Panzervolpiler to proc Viral because our Talons have not got any Viral setup equipped. Now for the Dread Ward Garuda setup, the build is mainly focused around duration, so that way we can get well over 20 seconds of health invulnerability from the augment. There's some other strange combinations we're using, as you'll notice. We're using Molt Reconstruct, so that way we can heal whenever we use any of our abilities. This means that we do not need to use her second ability for that health regen, and instead we can subsume it off for an ability of our choice. In this instance, we're using Viral Rush. Viral Rush is going to provide you with a lot of mobility and crowd control, dashing you forward, leaving cold damage vials everywhere, freezing them, and we're mainly using this to proc Arcane Ice Storm. Ice Storm is not only going to give us a large amount of strength when we freeze those enemies with said ability, but it's also going to increase our ability duration, meaning we get even more health and vulnerability time on Dread Ward. It's a niche combination, but I really like it because I want to be as tanky for as long as possible, and due to the combination of Narrow-Minded and Prime Continuity hitting our duration up super high, we have to compensate that range loss from Narrow-Minded with a lot of range, including overextended stretch and auger reach, which reduces our strength, which Arcane Ice Storm is compensating with in combination with Blind Rage and Growing Power. Contra Footed so we don't get knocked down, and then Blending Talons. This one is super optional. I personally really like it. It just makes her fall way more efficient, and it helps with the efficiency of our combo on our Talons as well. And then on Garuda, in my opinion, it's kind of a must. You really want some Tower Forged Amber Shards for casting speed, so that way you can use her and not feel as slow or restricted with her kit. And also, because we're focusing on the Talons here, we want to use secondary dexterity for our combo duration. We will quickly cover what my Nourish Influence build looks like, but I much prefer using melee Vortex on this Warframe. Viral Rush is a unique combination. I think it's very easy to forget about how useful grouping and mobility is on Garuda, and to be honest, I just don't think her second ability is useful due to Molt Reconstruct being here, because you can just spam cast your entire kit and get heals off of that. Now for the boring melee influence setup, we have to include this of course. We're using Shocking Touch to proc influence, and then instead of Weeping Wounds, I'm opting for Galvanized Elementalist. To be honest, either Weeping Wounds or Galvanized Elementalist are so similar in their performance, you can rock either of these on either build. And as I notice in here, we're not using Viral, and this time, instead of using the Panzervolpiler to proc it, we're instead using Nourish. And because Nourish, unlike Viral Rush, actually uses energy to be casted, it will also proc Molt Reconstruct, thus healing you. There's less duration on this build, and our form of survivability is not focused on the augment, and we're using Brief Respite with catalyzing shields and Auger Reach for a shield gate setup because we're spamming more abilities, and Nourish is better to spam cast than something like Viral Rush anyway. We've got a lot more range available here because we're not using Narrow-Minded, and instead we can fit in way more strength, and we're not using any cold abilities, so we've got Molt Augmented for our strength. Blending Talons returns once again. It's got the Viral, it's got the melee influence and the range, damage spread, and now all it's lacking is the grouping, because in the previous build we were getting grouping from melee Vortex, so to get bonus grouping in this build we are using the Nautilus as already stated. And here is the Vergless setup that I use with my Nautilus. I'd be lying if I said I didn't really enjoy melee influence on any build. We're in this unfortunate limbo state of Warframe right now, where if you're doing a melee build on YouTube, you're not allowed to use influence because everyone knows it's the best and it's what's worth using based on its performance and efficiency. But then we have a bunch of other melee arcanes which can be used and are good, but just because they are good or fun doesn't mean they're better than influence. So it's a case of, do I use a worse arcane in some sort of illusion to appear creative, or do I use the better arcane that is just more fun and more optimal? In YouTube context, it's difficult to pick, but if you're just playing the game, just choose whatever you find more fun. Melee influence is going to outclass Vortex, but overall the performance between arcanes, especially on melee weapons, is so similar across the board that it doesn't really matter which one you go with. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I don't love running melee influence with the Nourish build, because it's both efficient and satisfying, and we can't just pretend like it doesn't exist and then not proceed to show it off. And it would be beyond corny to just sit here and act like some sort of saint just because I used a different melee arcane in an attempt to appear creative. Vortex is just fun and I highly recommend you try it. And when it comes to Garuda's Talons, they are just incredible with any setup you run. Its base stats hard carry it, and yes, even though it is officially not an Exalted weapon, it is competing with all of the other Exalteds we covered in the previous tier list video. I'd recommend you check out that video if you have not. I appreciate your support on that, by the way. Just figured it'd be worth talking about Garuda's Talons because they're not really talked about ever, especially now with all the other Exalted weapons being the focus of most content because they have received, I guess, more options for builds even though they receive the same changes as Garuda's Talons. The Talons are just in a different spot because they're not officially Exalted, but they are secretly like the best melee in the game, I swear down. Anywho, if you like the video, feel free to drop a sub on the channel. If not, then no worries. Appreciate you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.